girls or boys, that hated quarrels, strife, and noise. I left an apple or a tart, or wooden gun, or painted cart. But where I found the children naughty, in manners rude, in temper haughty, thankless to parents, liars, swearers, boxers or cheats, or base tale bearers, I left a long black birchen rod, such as the dread command of God. Directs, what does that say? Parents' hand to use when virtue's path his sons refuse. Merry Christmas, kids. This 8-page poem was incredibly popular, as were these illustrations. And what I want to emphasize and begin to get us to think about is something that a lot of historians have pointed out, which is that the kinds of lessons that stories like this were teaching to children were not just about good kids get fruits and bad kids get a whip or a rod, but there was a lesson that was kind of, if you will, a kind of Christian theology on training wheels, or kind of a simplified child-like version of Christianity, right? If you act properly, if you act respectfully, you're going to receive rewards, both in this life and what the children would eventually come to understand as they grew spiritually in the afterlife. But if they acted in ways that were disrespectful, that were rejected the advice of their parents, they not only would begin to receive a whipping in this life, but it was setting them up for the eternal damnation and the eternal whippings they were going to receive if they maintained with their current behavior. So there's a lesson here for children that is sort of gently implying a kind of Christian theological message that a lot of Christians in the 18th century and 19th century wanted children to begin to absorb. That is, the ultimate impact of the kinds of behaviors they had now were going to have an eternal impact if they didn't shape up. So, this was 1821. And as I said, you see the Santa Claus here. He's still wearing a bishop's mitre. His name, Santa Claus, of course, as I said, is a derivation of St. Nicholas. We don't know where the reindeer story comes from, but very quickly after this poem took off and these illustrations took off, that becomes kind of built into Santa mythology. But as I talked about last year in my talk, one of the things that fascinates me about illustrations of Santa in the 19th century is that there was no consistency about what Santa should look like, or what he was supposed to look like. And so we have a sense here of Santa on a reindeer, and he's still wearing this bishop's mitre, but there was lots of illustrations and varieties of Santa Clauses that were really common throughout most of the 19th century. Kris Kringle was an anglicized version of a German term for the Christ child. There was also stories in Germany, Protestant stories of, instead of St. Nicholas bringing toys to children, the Christ child would bring toys to children. And instead of him doing it on St. Nicholas's Day, on the eve of December 6th, the Christ child would bring them on December 24th, right, the eve of Christmas. So these stories of Kris Kringle began to become popular, although I'm a little creeped out by this particular illustration. He's kind of an elfin creature. I'm not exactly comfortable with that guy. This is another version of Santa Claus in 1880. Yeah, he was a kind of a peddler. He was often depicted at, in fact, if you go back and look at the poem, The Night Before Christmas, Santa is described as a peddler and having kind of ratty clothing. And so depictions of Santa over the course of the 19th century had very little consistency. This is in 1884, Santa Claus, or St. Nicholas, became the patron saint of New York. Again, he's like this little elfin creature. This is an late 19th or early 20th century chocolate mold. Again, Santa has these kinds of magical qualities, and so he was often depicted as something like an elf, right? Something kind of mystical and magical. All right. Excuse me for 1 second. As Santa became more popular by the middle of the 19th century, this is the period in which businesses and store owners began to recognize that applying Santa or associating their store with Santa would be a way to begin to attract the public. And this started right in the 1840s. This is a drawing of Santa Claus. This is what one illustrator believed Santa looked like. And this popular woodcut was reprinted in newspapers all around the middle of the 19th century. Stores would use it to advertise that Santa had just come to their store in order to attract business. There's an advertisement from 1860 that reads, "Christmas is coming, and old Santa Claus close by loaded with all the luxuries of life for our store. Fine apples and firecrackers and candies." This is around 1860. And it began to just sort of explode after that. In 1868, Santa Claus was used on a box to sell sugar plums. I think I have another one here. Yeah, 1899 in FAO Schwartz. And as you can see, over the course of the 19th century, Santa Claus, through his popular illustrations, began to look more and more like the contemporary version of Santa Claus that we imagine. This just slowly began to develop over time as certain illustrators became more popular and the public was drawn to certain kinds of Santa illustrations. But even though Santa, in this context, is somewhat removed from any explicitly Christian theological teaching or training, there was still a push in the 19th century to emphasize the religious connections of Santa Claus and the way that this holiday could be used to teach kids Christian theological messages. And so I'm going to end here by talking about, or I'm going to begin to wrap up by talking about Annie and Willie's Prayer, which is another popular book. It's a poem. It came out in 1899. And one of the things that fascinates me about this book, as you'll see, is the way that it begins to combine, in a really interesting way, spiritual attitudes about this time of year with consumer interests at this time of year. So it tells the story of these two little kids, Annie and Willie, their brother and sister. They just got sent to their room, and the poem describes the tears on their pillows. Their father sent them to bed early. It's Christmas Eve, and they were upset. Not only that, but he also, right before he sent them to bed, happened to mention that there is no such thing as Santa Claus. And as the two kids are talking in bed, you also find this out about them. The little boy Willie says to his sister, "Are you awake?" And she says, "I've long tried in vain, but I can't shut my eyes, for somehow it makes me so sorry, because dear Papa has said there is no Santa Claus. Now we know there is, and it can't be denied, for he came every year before Mama died." So the two of them are sort of reflecting on this, and they decide to say a little prayer before they go to bed. And this is their prayer. "Dear Jesus, look down on my brother and me, and grant us the favor we're asking of thee. I want a wax dolly and a tea set and a ring and an ebony workbox that shuts with a spring, and bless Papa, dear Jesus, and cause him to see that Santa Claus loves us as much as does he. Don't let him get fretful and angry again, and dear brother Willie and Annie, amen." I'm fascinated by the complete interchange and lack of sort of desire to differentiate what exactly is Santa doing in this story versus what's Jesus doing in this story. They seem to be confused, and I suspect that that was on purpose. I don't think the writer mistakenly wrote the poem this way. I think that there was kind of a purposeful blending of Jesus and Santa Claus at this point. So here's what happens in the story. The father hears his children talking, and he goes up and he eavesdrops. You can see he's kind of clutching his heart because he has these like pangs of pain about his children's sadness. And so he then runs immediately to the stores and he buys them all of the things that they had asked for. And then the next morning when the kids get up, they see all of these fabulous presents, and the daughter concludes, "And now," added Annie in voice soft and low, "you'll believe there's a Santa Claus, Papa, I know." This is the second to last page. And I paused the first time I read this because I thought, there is a kind of alternative reading of this story because the story, in fact, made clear that there is no Santa Claus, right? The daughter believes in something, but the father has actually tricked her into believing that. And in fact, I skipped a few verses, but there's a small reflection on the father's part, reflecting on the fact that he tricked his children. But when you read this line and then turn to the last page, the poem is directed directly to parents now and not children. Blind father, who caused your stern heart to relent, and the hasty words spoken so soon to repent? 'Twas the being who bade you steal softly upstairs, and made you his agent to answer their prayers. So the relationship between Santa Claus and Jesus, between one's spirit and relationship to God in this poem towards the end of the 19th century are all kind of mixed up. And you can sort of see in the poem a kind of purposeful attempt to tie together one's belief in God and belief in Jesus and the rewards of family, these Victorian notions, right, of the sacred piety of the home. All of them are sort of being tied together. By the end of the 19th century, this is all becoming quite explicit. And this is about the time, the late 19th and early 20th century, that Santa Claus begins to take on the kind of definitive form that we think of when we think of Santa today. Thomas Nast did this famous drawing in 1881. And even though there were some later illustrations and drawings of Santa, this one became so popular that later illustrators would look back at it and use it as they began constructing versions of Santa. In the 1920s and 30s, I talked about last year, the Saturday Evening Post every Christmas would come out with Santa covers. This one was by J.C. Leondecker, and these covers were looked forward to and delighted. People would collect them. This one came out in 1923. Around the same time, this is Norman Rockwell also drawing for the Post, Santa and Expense Book in 1920. And then shortly after that, the illustrator, Hayden Sundblom, begins to look at these Saturday Evening Post covers and look back at the late 19th century illustrations, some of which I showed you, and they began to use the same style of Santa Claus as they saw on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. And so by the 1920s and by the 1930s, Santa Claus becomes a kind of standard visual object, right? His clothing has to be a certain way. His belt buckle, his boots, all that becomes standardized by commercial culture, which on the one hand certainly makes him a more popular figure. And one of the things I want to suggest is that the popularity of the commercialism of this holiday is also closely tied to the Christian spirituality of the holiday. That it's difficult to kind of separate out what are the commercial impulses of the holiday and what are the spiritual impulses of the holiday. The commercial impulses popularize a holiday that Puritans and Christians in the 18th and 19th century by themselves, I'm not sure would have succeeded in stamping this day as stamping this time of year as a sacred time. There's another Coca-Cola one. He's got his little list of good boys and girls, I guess, to deliver Coke to. All right, so I want to conclude now by talking about this notion. In the last couple of decades, I've seen my mother-in-law always buy sweaters that look kind of like this illustration. Jesus is the reason for the season. I've seen this expression or this phrase or similar phrases begin to become more prominent probably in the last 2 decades or so. And the impetus behind them reflects a kind of tension between the commercial aspects of Christmas and a reminder of what the holiday was originally supposed to be. But as I tried to argue in my talk tonight, what the holiday actually was at different periods of time is actually really complicated. And the religious lessons that come out of those poems and those books that I showed you versus the consumer side of Santa begin to get intermingled in the 19th century. And a question that I want to ask you is whether you think that is still the case today. The story of Santa Claus and the emphasis on belief in Santa Claus, does that retain some of the same qualities of that for children that we want, that Christians want adults to think about, right? Is belief in Santa Claus a kind of training wheels for belief in God or belief in Christ, right? Is this teaching children about this concept of faith in a way that children can embrace? And if this message, Jesus is the reason for the season, is one that resonates with you, I have some good news. You can buy Christmas cards with Jesus is the reason on them. You can buy t-shirts with Jesus is the reason. You can buy decorations for Christmas trees. You can buy buttons for some reason, blue and red and green and white. You can buy mugs. Jesus is the reason for the season. Mugs are incredibly popular. You can buy plates with Jesus is the reason for the season. You can get ties. You can get aprons. You can get towels. You can get snow globes. You can get keychains. And you can get bookmarks. I show you all this, and this is where I want to wrap up, not to sort of mock or ridicule this, what I think for a lot of Christians is a sincere desire to make this time of the year, to remind people of the spiritual beginnings of this holiday. I show them because I think that the people who are consuming these kinds of things are in fact consuming them in order to express their religious feelings about this holiday. And so I don't think that these consumer objects, these ties and t-shirts and plates and snow globes and keychains, are necessarily making the holiday less spiritual. I think that for a lot of people, consumerism is the way in which they are expressing their religious values. And that is true for Santa Claus as well. Thank you very much.
We have 15 minutes for questions, so Shanny, do you want to moderate your questions?
Sure. Questions, thoughts, comments? Yes.
Hey, I was just wondering at the beginning when, I actually have two questions. The first one is, at the beginning you said that that marrying Jesus with Santa Claus and having that be a training wheel. I was just wondering, given our shared interest in this subject, if there was a Satan figure kind of tempting the kids away from this path. And the second question I have, going in a different direction, given your talk, given the title and the talk about the sacred, I was just wondering if any at all did Henri Durkheim's sacred profane dichotomy influence your methodology?
Yeah, so I'm actually sort of challenging the notion that there is a clear distinction between aspects of our life that are sacred and then aspects that are profane, right? I'm arguing this paper, and as I do a lot in my work, I write about evangelical attitudes towards Hollywood in the 1920s. I wrote a paper this year about Christian gamers play video games and then describe the experience of the game. They play secular popular games like Halo and Call of Duty, if you're familiar with any of those, but they play them in teams of other Christians, and they talk about the experience as creating a kind of religious camaraderie, right? And so, they describe it as something that helps their sense of spirituality. So yeah, I think in a lot of my work, I'm sort of directly challenging the idea that there is such a distinction as things that are inherently sacred and things that are inherently profane, and then a lot of things that